today is also International Day of the African Child. This year's theme is Education for All Children in Africa. The time is now. According to UNICEF, less than 1 in 5 African countries are reaching the benchmark on education financing. Wongani Taulo, Regional Education Advisor at UNICEF Eastern as well as Southern Africa, joins us now to further unpack this. Wongani, a very good afternoon to you. Thank you so much for joining us. Look, stats indicate that 9 out of 49 African countries on the continent dedicated 20% or more of their public spending to education. Shocking, considering the fact that Africa is a youthful country. What do you think actually attributes to these low figures?
Thank you for having me. So this statistics is coming at the backdrop of a recent study that we have recently conducted jointly with the African Union to look at the trends of education spending across the region in Africa prior to COVID and post the COVID, so we can determine where the gaps are in terms of fulfilling the right to education for the children of this continent. And what we have seen is that there's a significant drop in terms of what countries in the region were spending on education prior to COVID, and during the COVID pandemic, we saw that there was a significant drop. On average, we saw that per capita spending dropped by about 8% in some of the countries, but as high as 25% in some other countries as well. And this has significant implications on fulfillment of education, particularly those at the lower base. And what we're seeing now is that, particularly during COVID, countries' budgets experienced significant fiscal constraint. One, because of the impact of the pandemic itself, in the sense that budgets were redirected to addressing the health pandemic, but that was also coupled with high debt burdens for most of the African countries. And then when you look at inflation and also just other humanitarian impacts on the budgets that were being experienced in the region. Recently, we've seen flooding, we've seen cholera outbreaks. So all these have had a compounding effect in terms of the fiscal space that is available for education.
But then exactly how much is needed, Wongani, for children's education on the continent? I mean, starting from primary to tertiary education, also taking into consideration that the different countries have differing models in terms of education funding. Example, here in South Africa, some schools are non-fee paying government schools in order to accommodate those that are less fortunate. And other regions like Botswana, where education is relatively free from start to finish.
What we have seen based on the most recent estimates is that Africa as a continent has a financing gap of about 183 billion US dollars annually to be able to meet quality education for every child. And I'm talking about quality education for every child because this is a right, and you will see that in many of the constitutions across the continent do provide for the right to quality and inclusive education. So even in the countries where governments are actually charging for the provision of education, even in those that education is actually free, in all those countries we still experience significant gaps. But what we know is that if governments commit to meeting at least 20% of their national budgets to education, they can be able to fulfill this particular right, looking specifically also on how they invest that particular 20% is what is most significant. And at us at UNICEF, we are saying the most efficient gains are actually invested when gained when you invest in the lower years of schooling, at the base of schooling, so at pre-primary education level, but also at the foundational level where you provide foundational literacy and numeracy in the early years of primary school. If we get it right by investing right in these particular early years, we'll be able to meet most of the expectations and goals that we have set for ourselves as a continent.
And it's quite concerning, right, Wongani, because, I mean, judging by the skills shortages across the country, if you're only spending a certain percentage, I mean, I understand here governments in Africa spend about 2% of their educational budgets on pre-primary education, while that 20% is only going to tertiary education. So over 100 million primary as well as secondary school age children are now out of school in Africa due to various socioeconomic reasons. UNICEF just reported that some children in South Africa are subjected to child poverty, leading to a number of developmental challenges. But I'm sure if we looked across the continent, Wongani, factors like displacement due to wars, unrest, then becomes a huge factor in child education. So how do we combat this scourge as well as invest in education as well as in the future generations?
You just ended by saying the future generations, and this is where we are saying it is critical that Africa plans for that future generation now. It is estimated that by 2050, Africa will be home to about 1 billion children who will need those particular services. And if countries don't prepare well now at this particular time, when aside of the fact that we have budget constraints, we are also experiencing these significant crises. And this is the reason why we need to be more consistent in terms of how we are spending on education, particularly because we need to build the resilience of those education systems so that they can be able to withstand the crisis and other external forces that we are experiencing as a continent. It is only by doing this that we'll be able to prepare for the future generation of this particular continent.